This is Going Underground. I'm Afshin Rattansi. Coming up in the show, as details emerge of Tony Blair's secret 2010 oil deal with Saudi Arabia, is our government today still waging war for its own oily profits? And 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Palestinians smashed through the occupied territory wall. But why is Britain continuing to support Israel even after the parliamentary Palestine vote? Plus, were we bombing Iraq during the 2-minute silence on Remembrance Sunday? All this and more on today's Going Underground. The fact that one of Rupert Murdoch's senior editors was jailed last week won't matter much to shareholders at tomorrow's annual general meeting of News Corp in Los Angeles. Murdoch's power over May's general election is undimmed. Right now, he is using his Sun, Times and Sunday Times newspapers to destroy Ed Miliband as Labour continues to lead in polling. Remember, it is Murdoch's papers that chair-led the war in Iraq, that cheerleads all UK foreign policy when it is in lockstep with Washington. It chair-led the bailouts after the financial crash of 2008. But it's not just his newspapers that exert a disproportionate influence on life in Britain. Books and films in Britain are de facto vetted by Murdoch because News Corp is involved in HarperCollins and 20th Century Fox. And his Sky News operation will never want to upset the interests of Murdoch as long as he is in control of the network. So, who can control the Citizen Kane of our times? Well, there is one man that certainly seems to have sway over the media mogul. Rupert Murdoch had been unwilling to fire one of his trusted lieutenants, Rebekah Brooks, until News Corp investor Prince Al-Walid bin Talal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud said this.
If the indications are for her involvement in this matter is explicit, for sure she has to go. You bet she has to go.
And so Murdoch reluctantly let Rebekah Brooks leave the best-selling newspaper in this country. But given the power of Prince Talal, who incidentally has stakes in Twitter, the London Savoy Hotel, Apple and Citigroup, maybe anyone wanting to win the next general election should have a word with the Saudi billionaire. In fact, given revelations about Tony Blair's lucrative connections to the Saudi royal family, Ed Miliband might do worse than give Blair a call. Britain is still supporting Israel despite renewed violence in the occupied territories. Amnesty International issued a damning report last week accusing Israel of war crimes in Gaza, but it seems to have had little impact on our government. That's despite nearly 20,000 homes destroyed and 13,000 Palestinians killed or wounded over the summer. So what did the parliamentary vote to recognize Palestine actually mean? Joining me now in the studio is former US Marine political analyst and activist Ken O'Keefe. Welcome, Ken, to Going Underground. The British MPs that we've been talking to, so proud that finally Palestine has been recognized in the House of Commons. There's more to this.
Well, the first thing I would say to people who really genuinely care about justice for Palestine is, why would anybody think that Western leaders have the best interests of Palestine at heart? Every Western leader you can name, almost without exception, has supported the so-called two-state solution. Isn't that a red flag in itself? And I'll certainly make an argument as to why it's not a good thing for the Palestinians.
Now, the one-state solution hardly gets any airtime at the moment. So just describe why the two-state solution, which in this country dominates all political debate about Palestine, isn't the one forward.
Well, let me posit this first. Let us suggest that instead of South Africa being one state, democratic, with everyone having equal rights, that the black South Africans got, say, 20% or 15% of South Africa and the apartheid system remained. Would that have been a good thing? Why would we suggest that today a two-state solution, which effectively would be the same thing, maintaining an apartheid Jewish supremacist state alongside an inferior, totally economically, militarily submissive state, which is only one false flag operation away from being pummeled? And if we look at the false flag history of Israel, whether it's the bombing of the King David Hotel, or whether it's the Levant affair, or the USS Liberty, or indeed 9/11, which has Mossad fingerprints all over it.
I've seen people proudly wear their pins in Parliament with the Palestine flag, saying the two-state one is the only solution. Why do you think they don't seem to understand? They sometimes compare it to South Africa, the situation in occupied Palestine or Israel. Why don't they understand that?
I can't answer for stupidity, but there are plenty of stupid people, whether they be Palestinian, whether they be Western, or any other
These are
such.
British politicians in the House of Commons, very pro-Palestinian, considered as being pro-Palestinian.
Well, let's see. The 1948 creation of Israel was on the back of the theft of Palestinian land. Enshrined in international law, UN Resolution 142, is the right of return. Any two-state deal inherently will include the denial of that right of return. I have family members who lost land in 1948, who have beautiful land in Jaffa, which is now Israel. Should they be denied their rights? Should they not be compensated? Should they not have access to the land? I don't think that's just at all. I can understand why the Palestinians would support it, if they truly want to support it, because they've been beaten down so badly for so many decades that perhaps they think that is the very best they can get. But for me, I'm not for whatever people think is pragmatic. I'm for justice. And to me, justice means justice, not some perverted, watered down, you get a paltry amount of land while the behemoth state of Israel continues.
We have a map of the shrinking state of Palestine up there. Well, then why was even this small concession, as maybe you would put it, or maybe it's an irrelevance, the vote on Palestine in the House of Commons, caused the British ambassador to Israel, Matthew Gould, saying, look, policy will remain the same, as if he had to reassure Tel Aviv. Indeed. Does that mean the vote was relevant?
Well, let's look at the history. It's very, very clear. Whether it's the Balfour Declaration and promises to help form a Jewish state, which did not consult the Palestinians at all, the British mandate walking out after the bombing of the King David Hotel, or even universal jurisdiction in this country, which largely at the behest of Israel has been effectively destroyed so that war criminals from Israel can come into the UK quite happily and be protected. All of this is very consistent. The British government has never and will never support justice for Palestinians, and I just don't understand how anybody can't see that.
Well, I have to, give some support to our forlorn MPs, as you put it. There was reaction in the Knesset. They said the British Parliament is encouraging terrorism and somewhat bizarrely encouraging the democratic authorities in Gaza, i.e. Hamas.
Yes. Well, at the end of the day, we used to call Nelson Mandela a terrorist as well. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan very famously said that. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That's pretty clear.
Do you see the British position as that settlement building is part and parcel of the way life exists in the Middle East?
It's shallow talk. The UK and the EU are doing roughly 30 billion euros a year in trade with Israel. Why aren't there sanctions against Israel? Israel has a nuclear weapons program to the tune of about 200 to 400 nuclear weapons, and some officials within Israel have threatened to use those weapons if their existence is threatened. Now, let's add that to the fact that Henry Kissinger and even the CIA have said that Israel will be no more in a short order. Is Israel actually going to carry through that threat? Well, they certainly have the means to do so. Has the British government done anything in any real substance to help the people of Palestine? No, they haven't. They've talked pretty words time and time again, but when it comes to actually doing something, no way will they do anything.
So what should a UK government be doing immediately if you were advising the Foreign Office?
Sanctioning Israel, cutting off all arms sales. Are you kidding me? We're giving arms technology to this state, which is killing Palestinians. It exterminated 92 families, entire families, in this latest mass murder in Gaza. What a disgrace that the British government continues to give technology to these people, which are committing the most atrocious of crimes against the Palestinians. Cut off all arms. Sanction that country, stop trade until it allows Gaza to be able to live a decent life, for the people of Gaza to be able to travel, trade, and ultimately stand on their own 2 feet. Aid is not the answer as well. People need to be very aware of the fact that aid is nothing more than a form of infiltration and subversion for most of the so-called aid agencies.
What does our coalition government get out of de facto defending the killing?
Well, they don't really get anything other than maintaining their position as bought and paid for puppets of the powers that be, those who control the money supply. They're carrying out the orders, so they will continue to get the favor of those who run the world.
But privately, they do care about the plight of Palestinians. It's as if there's something stopping them.
I'm sure many of these politicians, and this is well known in the U.S. as well, but many in England as well, will acknowledge secretly, or at least quietly, that they really resent having to kowtow to Israel on every level. But the bottom line is politics is run by money, and those who have an infinite supply of money effectively run politics. So these people, whether they like it or not, are largely beholden. There are some exceptions. There are some notable exceptions. There are some people of honor within the parliament, but very, very few.
Now, you've been covering this story, as it were, as an activist. I remember the Mavi Marmara, the brutal killing of activists trying to break the blockade of Gaza. At the moment, do you see Britain continuing to support Israel, with certainly in terms of trade and selling weapons, even after the summer of killing?
Israel is living on borrowed time. I have no doubt of this. The people will dictate the terms eventually. Right now, however, they don't fully realize the power they have. The only reason why the policy is changing at all and that the kind of statements that we're hearing from Parliament and the US Congress and whatnot are changing a bit is because too many people are aware of the bloodbath that is happening in Palestine on a regular basis and the horrendous crimes that have been covered up for decades, because this has been happening the whole time. Those things are coming to light, and that's making it politically untenable for these puppets, if you ask me, to maintain their position. So they have to speak in a more frank and honest way. But the substance of who they are and who they work for has not changed.
Ken O'Keefe, thank you.
Thank you, brother.
One irony has been clear in this time of remembrance, and that is that while veterans of Afghanistan may have sported red paper poppies on their lapels, their work in Afghanistan led to the greatest increase in opium poppy cultivation since anyone can remember. But Britain's wars haven't only changed ecosystems when it comes to narcotics. Thanks to recent British military action, water supplies have become poisoned, natural resources have been depleted, entire species have been eradicated. The hundreds of tons of depleted uranium dropped by UK and US forces in Iraq has resulted in the contamination of an estimated 300 sites in the war-torn country, with a huge rise in cancer-related deaths and a 17-fold increase in birth defects. The British Ministry of Defence, however, denies the connection. The radioactive weaponry apparently disperses toxic dust which can be inhaled and infect soil years after the shots have been fired. Next month, the UN is again voting to provide assistance to countries affected by the use of depleted uranium, with only the UK, US, France and Israel previously voting against. The UK is again one of 4 countries that have ruled out the banning of depleted uranium in weapons, even if the government says it will not be using it in new conflicts in Iraq and Syria. Whether this is believable or not, toxic ISAF weaponry has destroyed a third of Afghanistan's forests. Ensuing drought and desertification has killed millions of animals. As for migratory birds passing through Afghanistan, numbers have dropped by 85%. The environmental destruction caused by British involvement in Syria looks set to be no less catastrophic. Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond yesterday reiterated his support for arming what he called moderate Syrian rebels. Whether we end up supporting ISIS again or not, the legacy of our latest wars will last generations. Coming up after the break, what can we do to stop fossil fuel domination of government policy, home and abroad? And our drones may have a history of killing civilians in Afghanistan, but this week the MOD confirmed our first drone attacks in Iraq on Remembrance Sunday. All this and more in part 2 of Going Underground. The historic several £100 billion oil deal signed between Russia and China on Sunday leaves the UK and the US out in the cold, arguably. And David Cameron's response, he's threatening to tighten the pressure on Russia while ignoring the consequences of fuel poverty on austerity-stricken Britain. So what are British oil firms like BP doing? Apparently, they're spending their resources on taking on activists fighting corruption, according to Jess Worth, a campaigner and co-editor of the New Internationalist magazine. She believes she was targeted and spied on by BP, and she joins me now in the studio. Welcome, Jess, to Going Underground. So OPEC saying global energy demand is going to increase by 60% by 2040. What does it actually mean as regards British reliance on oil?
Well, for a start, I don't think we should take those OPEC figures seriously. OPEC is making these predictions based on a price of oil that is nowhere near realistic, and is assuming that no governments are going to take any action on climate change and reduce their dependence on fossil fuels. And that's just not realistic.
But arguably there hasn't been the kind of action on climate change as regards fossil fuels that people have been campaigning about, people like you have been campaigning about for years.
No,
has it been a failure?
Well, yeah, so far. And a lot of that has been to do with the oil industry and other fossil fuel companies lobbying governments extremely hard not to take serious action to drive a transition to renewable energy. But I think all of that is starting to shift. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the kind of decisive collective of thousands of climate scientists and economists from all over the world who kind of map climate change, carbon emissions, their impacts, and kind of try and predict what we need to do in order to avoid the worst. So their kind of flagship report came out last week.
Yeah, they say that on the one hand.
They basically said, we need to phase out all fossil fuels. That's the only way that we're going to avoid runaway climate change that would be catastrophic.
And that report came out around the time.
Yeah, that came out the same week as the OPEC report came out saying...
And the new oil fields, lots of Scottish independence referendum voters complaining about that one. So
we're on a collision course, basically,
between
the oil
Britain
industry
expansion
and climate change. And the science couldn't be clearer. You know, the UNFCCC said it is unequivocal that burning fossil fuels is causing climate change, and that essentially emissions need to peak by 2020 and then be reduced down to nothing over the next few decades.
So if the climate science couldn't be clearer, the lobbying couldn't be clearer either, because do you see any signs of Cameron, Clegg or Miliband, for that matter, wanting to stop current exploration in the North Sea? It seems to be expanding there.
No, I mean, Cameron campaigned by saying we're going to be the greenest government ever, but when you look at what they've done, they've essentially opened the UK up to fracking business, and a lot of that is fracked oil as well as fracked gas. They've given massive tax breaks to the North Sea oil industry. Just in the last budget, George Osborne gave almost $3 billion in tax breaks to BP and Shell to encourage them to drill more in the North Sea. So now, I mean, it's a very oil-friendly government. Several ministers used to work for oil companies, including Vince Cable, who's the Business and Industry Secretary. So yeah, we're definitely seeing the influence of the oil industry and the wider fossil fuel industry on UK policy. But that doesn't mean that that's the way that it's going to have to go, because more and more people are taking climate change seriously. There's a veritable renewables revolution going on in the UK and across the world, where now we're starting to see renewables.
I mean, it doesn't seem like it if the government is issuing new license permits created by a whole new oil and gas authority that the government have now created. I mean, we asked Lord Brown when he was on this programme about lobbying and the closeness with government, as you're alleging with our government, when it was called Blair Petroleum. And Lord Brown said, this is over-exaggerated. There is cross-fertilisation of personnel, but they are very separate, people in the oil industry and people in the government.
Lord Brown is the former CEO of BP and still has very close ties with BP. He is the chairman of Quadrilla, the UK's biggest fracking firm. He runs an oil and gas investment company, and he has a post in the Cabinet Office advising the government on how to operate more effectively. And he personally places high-up people from business in different departments to try and advise them. So Lord Brown is the epitome of the revolving door between the oil industry and politics, and you can see that influence very clearly in the policies that are coming out.
And as you've charted in some ways, a greater understanding of climate change, have you noticed that it seems to become a consumer story? At the moment, the big energy companies, big six energy companies being investigated by Ofgem. How do you see the story being created in the mainstream as being about fuel poverty, big six energy firms, but that's all separate to the climate science that you're talking about as regards the IPCC? Yeah,
the media just doesn't want to mention climate change. I guess it finds it too challenging, or it thinks that people are interested. But actually, if you look at how many people are concerned, concern about climate change has been rising over the last couple of years. If you look at the last climate march that happened in London a couple of months ago, tens of thousands of people out on the streets. We haven't had those numbers before on climate change. So I think governments are really, really out of tune with where people are at on climate change.
But there is
people
are austerity as well, which means there's climate change going to be occurring in pensioners' houses this winter.
Yeah.
Don't you think the main issue will be, well, we want cheaper fuel, because there
but
will be however many
fuel,
thousand old people dying this winter.
But cheaper fuel does not equate with fossil fuels. And this is the big myth that the big six energy companies want everybody to believe. Actually, gas is a really, really expensive source of fuel. Fracked gas is even more expensive because it's so expensive and kind of resource intensive to extract. You know, if we were actually rolling out renewable energy, solar panels, offshore wind and so on, properly across the UK, then once that initial investment has been put in, that's free energy. So if we're really serious about tackling fuel poverty, we ought to be investing in renewables rather than subsidising the oil industry to the tune of billions and billions of pounds so that they can extract more fossil fuels that are ultimately causing climate change.
Now we have a big spy character up, if we can see it up there, because when it comes to people that are fighting the causes you're fighting, we understand, I mean, BP told us, they monitor your YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, the whole organisation of BP.
Yeah.
Presumably have someone to monitor what you're doing on social media.
Well, they do have someone, because I've been doing so much campaigning on BP. I'd been working with Indigenous people living in the tar sands extraction area in Canada whose voices were just not being heard when they were saying, look, you're polluting our land, you're destroying our traditions and our livelihood, you can't be extracting these highly polluting fossil fuels on our doorsteps. They were being completely ignored in Canada, and that was being done by British companies, by Shell and BP. So I kind of hooked up with them and said, well, what would happen if we brought you over to the UK, took you along to the BP AGM, and you could say these things in person to BP and to the media? Shareholder
democracy in
Absolutely.
action.
And that was really powerful, and that got a lot of media coverage, and I think that's what got BP's attention. But then we also started targeting BP's sponsorship of arts and culture, because, as I was saying before, the oil industry just holds too much political and cultural power in this country, and so it's driving policies that aren't in everybody's interests. How do you break that power? Well, challenging its PR, its corporate sponsorship of, the Tate Britain just down the road, of the London 2012 Olympics and so on, is a way of destroying what it calls its social license to operate.
Because we expected BP to say, look, we're not doing anything criminal, which they aren't.
Yeah, I've got no evidence that they're doing anything criminal. I was surprised at how closely I was being monitored. I suspected that they might be keeping an eye because of all of these things that I've been doing. So I put in a subject access request, which is like a freedom of information thing, and got back a thick dossier, all names redacted, of them monitoring activities, meetings I was going to, what I'm saying on Twitter, what I'm saying on Facebook, even to the point where whoever this corporate spy was that they'd hired sent an email to his bosses at BP saying, Jess Worth has been invited to an event on Facebook that isn't about BP. I don't know whether or not she's going to go.
So the government not only is, as you say, right there together with those oil companies, the oil companies are right there with arts sponsorship right across the country.
John Brown is also the chair of the Tate, just to complete the
art
circle.
gallery. and of course, there are art events right up and down the country that BP try and use.
Yeah.
And probably all these more successful than the little BP flower logo, which obviously was trying to persuade everyone they were greener. What can be done in any sense to reflect the International Panel for Climate Change concerns when you're ranged against that kind of power?
I think that finding out that BP was monitoring me so closely actually gave me a sense of how powerful we are. They obviously see what we're doing, which is calling into question the legitimacy of BP as a sponsor for arts and culture, as potentially very, very dangerous to them. And that shows how important the social license to operate that they cultivate through sponsorship really is to them. Because if an oil company loses public support, then it loses political support. Then all of a sudden, regulation becomes possible, shifts in subsidies and tax breaks become possible. All of these policies that we actually need to properly tackle climate change and make the transition to a clean energy future all become possible if BP is less powerful. So what we're doing is very, very strategic, and it is aimed at undermining them in the public eye and getting major institutions like the British Museum, like the Tate Gallery, like the National Portrait Gallery to stand up and say, we recognise that climate change is a huge issue and that if institutions don't break their ties with fossil fuel companies, it's going to be a disaster for all of our members, everyone who wants to enjoy our art. There won't be any art in the future if we have a 6-degree world. Therefore, we accept that oil companies are not appropriate sponsors. End those ties. And that begins to make all of these other kind of political things possible.
Jess Worth, thank you.
Thank you.
We asked Lord Brown's office about the allegations made in this interview. The response was,
in his role as the government's lead independent director, Lord Brown works with the government to improve governance and efficiency across Whitehall departments. It is a non-political role, and Lord Brown is an independent crossbench member of the House of Lords.
Lost in yesterday's centenary armistice commemorations was the fact that hours before the ceremony, the Ministry of Defense announced they carried out their first lethal drone strike against ISIS in Iraq. It coincided with this ceremony when the Queen laid a wreath at the Cenotaph in central London to commemorate Remembrance Sunday. The RAF Reaper drone bombed a place near Baiji, where Iraq's largest oil refinery is located. We have no other sources to confirm the airstrike except the MOD, who said the drone successfully struck militants. Journalists should perhaps treat the MOD's statements with caution, though. This is how our allies define militants.
There's also been some dispute over the way civilian casualties are counted. The CIA often counts able-bodied males, military-age males who are killed in strikes as militants unless they have concrete evidence to sort of prove them innocent.
So maybe the Remembrance Sunday strikes controlled from a base in Lincolnshire killed just able-bodied military-aged males. As for where our drones are based, there is a degree of confusion. Some sources point the finger at Kuwait, the Persian Gulf dictatorship, from where ISIS initially drew its funding. Other sources say UK drones are based inside Iraq, with sources suggesting Balad or Erbil air bases. The Remembrance Sunday drone strikes are the first as part of Operation Shader to fight ISIS. They come after Britain admitted to killing civilians using drones in Afghanistan. Show's over, but on Saturday we talked to someone fighting David Cameron in his own Oxfordshire seat on behalf of the NHS. In the meantime, drop us a line on Twitter at underground_RT, like our page on Facebook, or email us on goingunderground@rttv.co.uk. See you on Saturday.